Welcome, true believers, to a journey through the oldest stories ever told. Stories that were carved into stone and whispered across winter fires, long before anyone thought to give them bright colours and glossy pages. Tonight, we are going to travel together through the dark and shining history of Thor Odinson, god of thunder, prince and king of Asgard, exile and warrior, and, in the end, something far more difficult and far more beautiful than either of those things. This is a story that moves through worlds beyond counting, through gold-roofed halls and frost-bitten wastes, through the long silence of exile and the deafening crash of war, through every shade of love and loss that a very ancient heart can hold. So settle in now and let your breathing slow and allow the thunder to roll in gently from a great and comfortable distance. There is no hurry here. The story has already happened, and it survived, and so did he. The world that produced Thor Odinson is not a simple place, and it never was. To understand the god, it helps enormously to understand the cosmos he was born into, because in the Marvel universe, the universe itself is not a backdrop but a participant, ancient and layered and full of its own opinions about how things ought to go. The Nine Realms are not merely planets or dimensions in the clinical scientific sense, though they are those things too, in their way. They are something older and stranger and more intimate than that description suggests. They are worlds that know each other, worlds that have history with each other, that have fought and mourned, and occasionally made a fragile, exhausted peace with each other across spans of time so vast that even the gods who inhabit them struggle to hold the full sweep of it in mind all at once. At the centre of this arrangement sits Yggdrasil, the World Tree, a cosmic structure so fundamental to the architecture of the Marvel Universe's mythology that calling it a tree almost undersells it. Yggdrasil is less a botanical object and more a living map of everything that exists, its roots sunk into the deep places of reality, its branches extending upward through dimensions that human language is only barely equipped to describe. The Nine Realms hang from its structure like lanterns from the boughs of something incomprehensibly old, each one distinct, each one governed by its own laws and its own peoples, and its own peculiar relationship to the concept of power. Asgard sits at something like the crown of this arrangement, though above and below are slippery concepts when applied to realms that exist in dimensions not governed by conventional geography. What matters is not the literal position but the symbolic one. Asgard is the realm from which order is maintained, the golden pivot around which the others rotate in their long, complicated orbits. Asgard itself, as the Marvel comics have rendered it across more than 6 decades of storytelling, is a place of extraordinary and somewhat unsettling beauty. The architecture is impossible by the standards of any merely physical engineering. Towers of burnished gold rising into skies that cycle through colours no terrestrial atmosphere ever produced. Bridges of stone and light spanning distances that would take a mortal lifetime to walk. The Great Hall of Odin, Valaskjalf, contains the throne Lidskjalf, from which the All-Father can, when he chooses, observe all the worlds at once, a gift and a burden simultaneously, as all genuine gifts tend to be. The city is full of warriors and scholars, of servants and nobles, of the ordinary domestic commerce of any civilization that has had long enough to develop its full complexity. People eat and argue and fall in love and grieve in Asgard, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat drifts through the same corridors where cosmic decisions are made. This is one of the things that makes the Asgardian mythology as Marvel has developed it so persistently compelling. The grandeur and the mundane coexist without embarrassment, which is perhaps the most honest thing any mythology can do. The other 8 realms arrange themselves around Asgard in a configuration that the comics have explored with varying degrees of detail over the years, but whose emotional logic has remained fairly consistent. Midgard, Earth, sits somewhere in the middle of the arrangement, a young and small and surprising world that keeps attracting the attention of beings far older and more powerful than its inhabitants, for reasons that the gods themselves sometimes find difficult to fully articulate. There is something about Midgard, about the brief, fierce lives of its mortal people, that functions like a kind of gravity in the mythological imagination. Even the most ancient and powerful of the Asgardians find themselves pulled toward it, drawn by something that defies purely rational explanation. Jotunheim, the realm of the frost giants, is Asgard's oldest and most complicated neighbour. The relationship between Asgard and Jotunheim is the relationship between two civilizations that have been at war long enough for the war to feel like weather, like something that was always there and always will be, a background condition of existence rather than a political choice that could in principle be unmade. The frost giants are enormous and cold, and possessed of a power that is elemental rather than refined, the power of glaciers and blizzards, and the deep silence of winter at its most absolute. They are not evil in any simple sense, though the Asgardian tradition tends to frame them that way, and this framing itself becomes one of the story's quietly important complications as the narrative matures. The war between Asgard and Jotunheim is old enough to have calcified into mythology on both sides, each people carrying a story about the other that is true enough to sustain the conflict and incomplete enough to make resolution perpetually elusive. Nidavellir is the realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen whose forges have produced many of the most significant objects in the Nine Realms' history, including weapons and artifacts whose influence on Thor's story specifically cannot be overstated. Alfheim is the home of the Light Elves, beings of radiance and serenity whose relationship to the rest of the realms is somewhat removed, as if they exist at a slight angle to the urgencies that preoccupy everyone else. Svartalfheim is darker, the realm of the Dark Elves. Creatures whose history with Asgard is long and bitter and whose most significant representative, Malekith the Accursed, will eventually become one of the most consequential figures in Thor's story. Muspelheim burns at the far end of the cosmological arrangement, a realm of pure fire ruled by the demon Surtur, whose ambition to plunge all the realms into conflagration is ancient and patient and never entirely dormant. Niflheim and Helheim together constitute the shadowed territories of the dead, realms of cold mist and half-life where those who fall without glory make their long, quiet residence. And Vanaheim is home to the Vanir, a people with their own form of magic and their own complex historical relationship with the Aesir of Asgard, a relationship shaped by an ancient war that ended in something that could generously be called peace. What is important to carry forward from this broad survey is not the individual geography of each realm, but the sense of a cosmos that is deeply, inescapably interconnected, a web of relationships and grievances and dependencies that means nothing in any one realm can happen in isolation from everything else. Thor's story is not the story of a man who operates in a contained environment. It is the story of someone who stands at the intersection of all of these connections, who carries the weight of all of these histories in his blood and his choices, who is shaped by forces that began moving centuries before he was born. This is the world into which Odin Borson brought a son, and it is the world that Son would spend an immeasurable lifetime trying to understand and protect. Odin All-Father is not an easy figure to summarize, and any account of Thor's story that tries to reduce him to a simple, parental archetype, the distant father, the impossible standard, the eventual figure of reconciliation, will find that the material resists the reduction. He is all of those things, certainly, but he is also a genuinely ancient being, whose decisions have been shaped by experience so vast and so costly that the wisdom they produced is sometimes indistinguishable from cruelty. Odin has sacrificed enormously for the knowledge he carries. He gave an eye to the well of Mimir for wisdom. He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights to gain the knowledge of the runes. These are not metaphors in the mythological framework of his world. They are things that actually happened, that left actual marks on him, that brought him an understanding of how the cosmos works that comes at the price of a certain distance from the ordinary emotional textures of living. As a king, Odin is formidable and subtle, a politician and a warrior in equal measure, someone who has kept Asgard stable across an era of time that makes human civilizations look like brief candle flames. He understands the long game in ways that can make his short-term decisions seem baffling or heartless to those operating with a narrower view. He keeps secrets not from indifference to the people he keeps them from, but because he has lived long enough to know that some truths must be introduced at the right moment, or they will do more damage than the concealment did. This is a philosophy that produces genuine wisdom, and also genuine harm, sometimes at the same time, and the story of Thor and Odin is in large part the story of a son who had to live through the harm in order to eventually understand the wisdom, and who had to maintain love through both. As a father, Odin contains contradictions that are recognizable even across the cosmic scale on which they play out. He loves his sons, both of them, though the nature and the expression of that love are complicated by his role as king, by the specific pressures of succession, by the secrets he carries about both boys' origins and futures. He is not warm in the way that Frigga is warm. He does not make comfort easy or tenderness reflexive. His approval is not freely given, and its withholding does damage over the course of years in ways that he perhaps does not intend and certainly does not fully account for. He is also, underneath all of the grandeur and the cosmic weight, someone who grieves, who has lost people he loved, who carries the accumulated sorrow of a very long life in ways that are not always visible, but are always present. The All-Father is a figure who commands awe, earns occasional genuine admiration, and generates in those who know him best a complicated mixture of love and frustration that never quite resolves into something simpler. Frigga, Queen of Asgard, stands in deliberate contrast to Odin's monumental quality. Where Odin's wisdom is architectural, built from sacrifice and calculation and the long view, Frigga's is woven through relationship, through attention to the people around her, through a practice of care that does not ask for recognition. She is a practitioner of Seda, the Norse magical tradition associated with prophecy and the hidden nature of things, and this gift mirrors her broader sensibility. Frigga is someone who sees beneath surfaces, who understands people with a generosity and accuracy that Odin's more strategically calibrated intelligence does not always achieve. Her presence in Asgard is not loud, but it is structural. She is the warmth in the walls of a building that might otherwise be only imposing, and that both Thor and Loki, in their very different ways, are shaped by her in ways they will not fully understand until much later. This, then, is the world and the family into which Thor Odinson is born, and the weight of it, the sheer accumulated complexity of the cosmos that will be his inheritance, is something worth sitting with for a moment before the specific events of his story begin to unfold. Because one of the things that makes Thor's journey so rich and so enduring is precisely that he does not begin with an understanding of this complexity. He begins in gold and certainty, with a warrior's clarity about right and wrong and strength and honour, and the story is the long, patient process by which that clarity is complicated into something more honest, more humble, and ultimately more genuinely powerful than the original bright confidence ever was. The child who would become the god of thunder arrived into Asgard the way all genuinely significant things arrive, without announcement, without any outward sign that the moment was different from the thousand ordinary moments surrounding it, and yet with a quality of presence that the people nearest to him seemed to register somewhere beneath conscious thought. He was golden from the beginning, golden in colouring and golden in temperament, possessing even in infancy that quality of radiance that would later make mortals stop in the middle of whatever they were doing and simply look at him. Frigga held him and knew him. The way mothers in every realm seem to know the essential nature of their children before language exists to confirm it. Odin observed him with the particular attention of a king evaluating an heir, which is a different thing from the attention of a father observing a son, though both were present, folded together in ways that Odin himself might not have been able to fully separate. The Norse myths that gave birth to Thor long before Marvel Comics discovered him are worth pausing over, because they cast a long shadow across everything that follows, and understanding that shadow helps illuminate the choices that the comics made in translating an ancient tradition into a modern one. In the original Norse mythology, Thor is already a figure of enormous complexity. He is not simply the strongest god, though he is certainly that. He is the protector of Midgard, the defender of humanity against the chaos represented by the giants, and the serpent Jormungandr, whose coiling presence beneath the ocean is a constant reminder that the order of the world is not guaranteed but must be actively maintained. The ancient Thor is a working god in a sense that some of his divine colleagues are not. He travels, he fights, he gets his hands dirty. There is something deeply unpretentious about the mythological Thor even at his most violent, a quality of showing up and doing what needs doing that distinguished him from the more strategically remote figures of the Norse pantheon. The Marvel Comics version, introduced to readers in August of 1962 through the pages of Journey into Mystery, number 83, took this ancient template and did something both faithful and inventive with it. The creative team understood, perhaps intuitively, that what made Thor enduringly compelling as a mythological figure was not his power, which is frankly rather straightforward, but his relationship to that power. The way his strength was always in service of something beyond himself, always oriented outward toward protection rather than inward toward domination. They preserved this quality while giving it a new context, a modern world where gods walked among skyscrapers and the thunder rolled between buildings of glass and steel rather than across mountain ranges and open sea. And they gave him something that the mythological tradition only gestured toward, a rich interior life, a psychology, a set of contradictions and growth points that would sustain stories across more than 6 decades without exhausting themselves. The young Thor of Asgard, the boy before the exile and the education, and the long reckoning with his own character, is a figure who rewards compassionate attention. He is not villainous. He is not even, in any simple sense, wrong. He is something more familiar and more sympathetic than either of those descriptions would suggest. He's someone who has been raised in conditions that make a certain kind of mistake almost inevitable, and who has not yet encountered the specific circumstances that will make that mistake visible to him. The mistake is not cruelty or dishonesty or the desire to harm. It is something subtler and more common, the assumption that the qualities one possesses naturally are the same as the qualities one has earned, that the strength in one's hands is a form of virtue rather than a form of fortune, that virtue must subsequently be built around. Asgard's culture did not make this confusion easy to avoid. The warrior tradition of the Aesir valued strength, courage, martial excellence, and the particular kind of honour that expresses itself in directness and decisive action. These are genuine values, and Thor absorbed them genuinely, not as performance but as lived belief. He trained with a seriousness that went beyond simple desire to please his father or impress his peers. He wanted to be good at the things Asgard considered worth being good at, and he was, magnificently, almost effortlessly, in ways that created their own subtle problem. Effort is one of the most important teachers a person can have, and someone for whom the things their culture values come easily is deprived of effort-specific curriculum. Thor did not struggle to be strong. He did not struggle to be brave. And so, the lesson that struggle teaches, the lesson about the relationship between what one is and what one chooses, did not arrive for him through the ordinary channels. His relationship with Frigga in these early years was the softest and most uncomplicated love of his life, and he knew it even then, with the particular clarity that children sometimes have about the things that are most essential to their existence. She taught him things that the warrior culture around him did not or could not or chose not to. She taught him that magic was not a lesser thing than martial strength, that the ability to see beneath the surface of events was as important as the ability to affect events directly. She taught him, through the patient example of her own behaviour, that wisdom was not the same as knowledge, that knowing a great many things was far less valuable than understanding what those things meant and how they related to each other. Thor listened to these lessons with genuine attention and genuine love for the person delivering them, and he carried them forward in some deep chamber of himself, even during the years when his conscious mind was occupied with entirely different concerns. The hammer Mjolnir entered Thor's consciousness not as an object he possessed, but as a concept he grew up within, the way children grow up within the concept of their family's most central values, absorbing them through proximity before they are old enough to consciously evaluate them. Mjolnir was made in the dwarven forges of Nidavellir by the brothers Sindri and Brokkr, crafted from a metal called uru that the comics describe as possessing unique properties of magical conductivity, capable of channeling and amplifying the power of whoever wields it in ways that no ordinary material could sustain. The circumstances of its creation, according to the mythology, involve trickery and a wager, and the characteristic chaos of Loki's involvement in events that would have gone more smoothly without him, but the result is something that transcends its complicated origins. Mjolnir is, in the hands of someone worthy, arguably the most significant weapon in the 9 realms, and this is not primarily because of its destructive capability, though that is considerable, but because of the enchantment that Odin eventually places upon it, the enchantment that makes its power conditional on the character of whoever holds it. For young Thor, Mjolnir was his, the way certain objects come to feel like extensions of the self rather than external possessions. He lifted it naturally. He wielded it with a fluency that looked like destiny, and perhaps was, at least in part. The hammer responded to him completely, and this completeness of response felt from the inside like confirmation, like the universe itself agreeing with his self-assessment. This is one of the more psychologically precise observations embedded in the Thor mythology. The way external confirmation of our strengths can, in the absence of a sufficiently challenging counter-experience, produce a subtle but significant distortion in our understanding of ourselves. Thor was not arrogant in the way that a person is arrogant when they have decided to think well of themselves against the evidence. He was arrogant in the way a person is arrogant when the evidence has never adequately tested the conclusion, when every piece of available information supports the belief that one is as capable and as worthy as one feels. His childhood friendships were deep and genuine, formed with the other young warriors of Asgard who would eventually become the companions of his adventures, the Warriors Three and the Lady Sif among them. Volstagg. Enormous and warm and possessed of an appetite for both food and stories that made him a centre of gravity in any gathering. Fandral, quick and charming, and privately more thoughtful than his easy manner suggested. Hogun, quieter and steadier, a presence whose calm was not the calm of someone who had nothing to say, but of someone who had learned the value of saying things at the right moment. And Sif, whose own story is one of the most quietly compelling in Asgardian mythology, a warrior who had to fight for her place in a tradition that did not initially design itself with her in mind, and who emerged from that fight with a quality of hard-won certainty that complemented and sometimes usefully challenged Thor's more assumption-based confidence. These were the people who shaped the daily texture of his young life, and their company produced in him a loyalty that was one of his most genuine and most enduring qualities. Thor did not take friendship lightly. The people he loved with the same wholehearted intensity he brought to everything, and the bonds formed in those early Asgardian years would prove more resilient than almost any force the universe later brought to bear against them. The relationship with Loki in those early years was the most important relationship of Thor's formation, and it was already complicated before either of them was old enough to understand why. Loki was his brother, the person who had been present for every significant moment of his childhood, the one who knew him most completely, and whose opinion therefore mattered in a way that even Frigga's and Odin's did not, because it came from someone who was supposed to be his equal, his companion, his other half in the siblinghood that royal children of warrior cultures depend on for the particular kind of identity formation that only peers can provide. That Loki was not quite his equal, not in the eyes of Asgard's culture, not in the eyes of their father, and in some wordless but clearly felt way not quite in his own eyes either, was a fact that neither of them had the tools to address directly when it first began to matter. The disparity expressed itself in small ways at first. In the way celebrations of Thor's martial accomplishments filled the hall, while Loki's more subtle achievements in sorcery and strategy received the quieter, more qualified acknowledgement that Asgard reserved for things it respected less than it respected the ability to win a fight. In the way worthy, as a concept, seemed to be defined, in the world they both inhabited, in terms that fit Thor naturally, and required Loki to translate himself into something he was not. Thor loved his brother. This is important to say plainly, because it is true, and because it remains true through everything that follows, including things that would test the most durable love imaginable. The love was real, and the love was sometimes not enough, and both of these facts are part of the story. In those early years, before the full weight of what Loki did not know about himself had time to compress into something harder and more dangerous, there were genuine moments of companionship between them, genuine laughter and shared mischief, and the particular intimacy of two people who have grown up knowing each other's most embarrassing secrets. Loki was brilliant and funny and occasionally terrifying in the way that very intelligent children are terrifying, capable of seeing straight to the heart of a situation that had confused everyone else, and then doing something with that clarity that was not entirely predictable. Thor admired this about him, with a straightforward lack of self-consciousness that Loki perhaps found as painful as it was gratifying. Because admiration offered from a position of uncomplicated security is not quite the same as the recognition that Loki was actually seeking. By the time Thor was approaching the age at which Asgardian princes were expected to demonstrate themselves worthy of greater responsibilities, to begin the formal process of becoming the warrior king that his birth and his abilities seemed to have prepared him to be, he was already everything that Asgard's tradition said a future king should look like. He was physically magnificent, brave without apparent effort, beloved by the warriors who served alongside him, and possessed of a certainty about his own judgment that was complete enough to be genuinely dangerous. He was not ready, though he would not have understood this if told, and the specific way in which he was not ready would take an exile and a fall and a significant amount of carefully administered suffering to fully reveal. This is the golden boy that the story begins with. Not a villain, not a fool. A genuinely good person whose goodness had not yet been tested by the kinds of circumstances that reveal whether what looks like virtue is virtue, or whether it is simply virtue's absence of opposition. The thunder that would eventually make his name synonymous with power was already his, easy in his hands, answering to his voice with the warm reliability of something that has always known where it belongs. What he did not yet have was any real understanding of what the thunder was for, of what power serves when it is serving something worthy of service, of the long, slow, sometimes agonizing process by which a god learns to be genuinely worthy of the hammer that has always been glad to be held. The story of Loki begins, as the most significant stories tend to, long before the person at its centre has any awareness that a story is being written around them. It begins in cold and silence, and the specific kind of loss that is so absolute it doesn't immediately register as loss, because the mind has no prior experience of comparable scale to measure it against. It begins on a battlefield in Jotunheim, in the aftermath of a war between Asgard and the Frost Giants that had been grinding forward for longer than most civilizations have existed, and it begins with a small thing found in a large silence, which is perhaps the most quietly devastating way any life can begin. Odin Borson walked through the ruins of a frost giant temple at the end of the last great war between their peoples, and he found an infant. The child was frost giant by blood, small only by the standards of his own kind, which is to say small only in the way that something which will eventually become enormous is small before it has had time to grow. He was the son of Laufey, king of Jotunheim, left in that cold and broken place with a deliberateness that said something about the calculations of kings and the specific cruelty of a culture that measured worth by size and power, and found the child before it wanting by both measures. Laufey had abandoned his own son because the boy was small, by frost giant standards, and in a civilization that valued nothing more than the physical expression of dominance, smallness was not a condition that admitted of compassion or accommodation, it was simply a disqualification. Odin looked at this abandoned child and made a decision that was, like most of Odin's significant decisions, simultaneously an act of genuine feeling and a piece of long strategic calculation, with the two motivations so thoroughly interwoven that separating them into distinct threads would be a falsification of how the choice actually worked. He felt something, looking at that infant, something that his long experience of war and loss and the specific texture of frost giant suffering had not entirely extinguished in him. He also understood, with the part of his mind that never stopped being a king, that an Asgardian-raised frost giant prince might one day be a bridge between two peoples whose perpetual warfare was expensive and exhausting for everyone involved. Both things were true. Both things informed what he did next. He took the child home, and he and Frigga raised him as their son, and they named him Loki. And they did not tell him what he was. The silence around Loki's origins was not a casual omission. It was a sustained and deliberate concealment, maintained across the whole of his childhood and youth, through years and decades of daily life, in which the truth sat just beneath the surface of everything, and was never once allowed to break through. Frigga knew and loved Loki genuinely and without reservation regardless of what she knew, which is perhaps the most important thing to say about her role in this story. Her love was not contingent and not conditional, and not shaped by the secret she kept, which means that whatever damage was done to Loki by the concealment, it was not done by her love, which was real. Odin kept the secret with the conviction of someone who has decided that the timing of a truth matters as much as the truth itself, which is a defensible position that nonetheless produced consequences he did not adequately anticipate. What Loki knew of himself growing up was this. He was Thor's brother, and he was Asgardian, and he was the son of Odin and Frigga, and he was not the same as the people around him in ways that he could feel without being able to name. The feeling without the name is perhaps the most disorienting kind of knowing, because it cannot be addressed directly, cannot be argued with or resolved through confrontation, can only be lived with as a persistent unease that colours everything from the inside without being visible from the outside. Loki was extraordinarily gifted at not appearing to be unsettled. This was, in some ways, his first and most significant piece of magic, the creation of a surface that did not reflect the interior, the performance of ease and wit and sharp intelligence that deflected attention from whatever was happening deeper down. He was genuinely intelligent, and this is worth dwelling on. Because the intelligence is not incidental to his story but central to it. Loki's mind worked in ways that the Asgardian culture around him both valued and was made slightly uncomfortable by. He could see patterns that others missed. He could hold multiple competing possibilities in his mind simultaneously without the anxiety that this multiplicity produced in people accustomed to thinking in more linear terms. He had an instinct for the pressure points of situations, for the precise application of the right word or the right action at the moment when it would have maximum effect, which is a quality that is invaluable in a diplomat or a strategist, and is experienced as threatening by people who are used to being the most capable person in a given context. In a culture that celebrated martial excellence above almost everything else, Loki's particular form of brilliance was legible as cleverness rather than greatness, which is a distinction that carries enormous social and emotional weight. His practice of magic developed early, and with a commitment that mirrored, in its seriousness, Thor's commitment to martial training, though the culture around them did not treat the two pursuits as equivalents. Seda, the tradition of Norse magic, was something Frigga practiced and something Loki was drawn to, with the recognition of someone discovering a language they were born to speak. The spells and illusions and shape-shifting that Loki would become notorious for were not tricks or shortcuts in his understanding. They were a rigorous discipline, requiring precisely the kind of sustained intellectual effort and creative flexibility that his mind was built for. And he approached them with a devotion that deserved more recognition than it received. The fact that Asgard tended to view sorcery as somewhat less honourable than swordsmanship was one of the smaller but most consistently corrosive ways that his home culture communicated to him, not through any single statement, but through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small signals that the things he was best at were not quite the things that mattered most. The comparison to Thor was structurally inevitable and structurally unfair, and the fact that it was unfair did not make it less constant. Thor was everything that Asgard's mythology said a future king should be, physically, temperamentally, in terms of the specific qualities that warrior cultures across every realm tend to celebrate and reward. Loki was not those things, and this was not a failure of effort or ambition on his part, but simply a fact about who he was, a fact that the world around him had not developed adequate vocabulary to honour. The contrast between them produced in Loki something that he himself might not initially have characterized as pain, because the word pain suggests a clean and obvious wound, and what he experienced was more diffuse than that, more atmospheric, the slow accumulation of a sense that his place in the story he inhabited was always going to be secondary, always going to be defined in relation to someone else's primary claim on the available glory. He loved Thor, in these early years, with the complicated love of a sibling who is also, inescapably, a rival, and who has never been given the tools to think about that rivalry in terms that might resolve it into something more sustainable. The love was real. The admiration even was real because Thor's qualities were genuinely admirable, and Loki was clear-eyed enough to see them without the distortion of pure envy. What made the situation psychologically untenable was not that Thor had qualities Loki lacked, but that the world seemed to have decided those were the only qualities worth having, and that this decision had been made without consulting Loki or acknowledging the very considerable qualities he possessed in abundance. He did not want to be Thor. He wanted to be recognized as someone whose way of being in the world had value equivalent to Thor's, and this was a want that Asgard's culture, in its particular and deeply ingrained configuration, was not equipped to satisfy. The discovery of his true origins did not happen through a calm, prepared conversation in which Odin sat with his adopted son and provided context and reassurance alongside the revelation. It happened, as the most destabilizing discoveries tend to happen, at a moment of already elevated tension, when the psychological architecture that had been maintaining a functioning surface was already under stress and therefore less able to absorb the additional weight of a truth this large. In the comic's telling, the moment comes during a confrontation with Loki himself, and it is not a gentle unfolding but an abrupt collapse, the kind of revelation that does not arrive as information but as an earthquake, restructuring everything that was built on top of it simultaneously and without warning. What Loki learned in that moment was not simply that he was a frost giant. The biological fact, though significant, was in some ways the least devastating part of what the knowledge contained. What he learned was that his entire understanding of his own history was false. That the story he had been living inside, the story in which he was Odin's son, and Frigga's son and Thor's brother by blood and birth, was a constructed thing, a narrative that had been built around him by people with their own reasons for building it. The ground that a person's identity is built on does not need to be solid for the identity to function, as long as the person believes it to be solid. The moment the belief fails, the moment the ground is revealed as something other than what it appeared to be, the whole structure above it becomes uncertain in ways that no amount of careful reassessment can immediately stabilize. He did not know, in that moment of discovery, how to hold the new information alongside the things that were still true. Frigga's love was still real. The years of growing up in Asgard were still real. The friendship with Thor, the training in sorcery, the 1,000 ordinary days of a life that was genuinely his even if its foundations had been concealed from him, all of that was still real. But the knowledge of the concealment cast a retrospective shadow across everything, made it impossible to look back at any part of the past without wondering what else had been managed, what other truths had been calibrated for him. What other aspects of the story he had been living were shaped by decisions made for him rather than with him? Odin's motivations, examined with the compassion they deserve, were not malicious. He had taken a child who would otherwise have died in the cold, given him a family and a home and opportunities for a life of significance and meaning. He had kept the truth because he understood how the knowledge would land, and he was attempting, in his way, to protect Loki from it until he judged Loki ready to receive it, which is the kind of protection that can look indistinguishable from control when viewed from the receiving end. The problem with Odin's approach to Loki, the deepest structural problem that produced consequences neither of them could have entirely avoided once the pattern was established, is that it treated Loki as someone to be managed rather than someone to be trusted, and this distinction is one that very intelligent people tend to feel in their bones long before they can articulate it consciously. The question of what Odin had intended by the adoption was one that Loki would turn over and over in his mind across the years that followed, examining it from different angles, arriving at different conclusions depending on the emotional state from which he was approaching it. Was he a hostage, a political instrument, a hedge against future conflict with Jotunheim? Was he a genuine act of compassion, a child saved because a powerful man looked at an abandoned infant and could not walk away? Was he both, simultaneously? And was the simultaneous truth worse or better than either possibility alone? These questions did not have clean answers, and Loki was someone whose mind required answers, who was uncomfortable with the sustained ambiguity that the questions produced, who would spend enormous amounts of energy and cause enormous amounts of damage in the process of trying to force a resolution that the material simply did not support. The seeds of everything that follows are present in this story, not as destiny, not as the inevitable unfolding of a character flawed beyond redemption, but as the understandable consequences of specific conditions applied to a specific kind of mind over a specific span of years. Loki is not broken. He is someone who received, in addition to real love and genuine privilege and extraordinary natural gifts, a wound that was never adequately acknowledged, and who then had to live with that unacknowledged wound inside a world that was not equipped to help him understand it. The tragedy of Loki, the quality that makes him one of the most psychologically compelling figures in Marvel's long history, is not that he was born bad, but that he was shaped by circumstances that made certain destructive choices feel, from the inside, like the only forms of agency available to him. And the love that persists beneath all of it, Thor's love for him and his for Thor, is not a sentimental addition to an otherwise dark story. It is the thing the story is most honestly about. The wound that Loki carried from the discovery of his origins did not immediately transform him into the architect of catastrophe that he would eventually become. Wounds of that particular kind, the ones that restructure a person's entire understanding of their own history and place in the world, do not work that quickly. They work slowly, the way water works on stone, not with a single dramatic impact, but through patient, repeated contact that gradually changes the shape of everything it touches. In the years between the discovery and the events that would force a reckoning between the brothers, Loki continued to exist within the structures of Asgardian life, continued to practice his sorcery and attend the feasts and stand beside Thor in the Great Hall. And the surface of things remained largely intact even as something beneath it was being quietly and irreversibly altered. Thor, for his part, moved through this period with the uncomplicated momentum of someone whose world had not yet presented him with a reason to slow down and examine his assumptions, and this momentum, so natural and so genuine, was itself a kind of pressure on the situation, not because Thor intended any harm by it, but because the ease of his forward movement made the difficulty of Loki's stillness more visible by contrast. The specific incident that precipitated Thor's exile from Asgard grew from a combination of factors that had been accumulating for years beneath the golden surface of his confidence, and it would be insufficient to describe it simply as a mistake, though it was certainly that. It was the kind of mistake that could only be made by someone who had not yet developed the internal apparatus necessary to recognize it as a mistake before making it, someone whose entire formation had produced in him the certainty that decisive action was the highest form of response to any provocation, that strength deployed with conviction was its own justification, and that the right to make decisions on behalf of those one felt responsible for protecting did not require consultation with the people those decisions would affect. These are not bizarre beliefs. They are beliefs that the culture around Thor had been quietly reinforcing his entire life, and he had absorbed them the way anyone absorbs the foundational assumptions of their formation, not as opinions that might be wrong, but as the shape of how things simply were. The Frost Giants came to Asgard during a ceremony that was already charged with significance, a formal occasion in which Thor was to be invested with greater responsibility, brought closer to the role of king that had been waiting for him since his birth. The ceremony was interrupted by the presence of Frost Giants in the vault, where Asgard kept the casket of ancient winters, the object of immense elemental power that Asgard had taken from Jotunheim as a trophy of the last great war, and whose possession by Asgard had always been one of the sharpest points of grievance in the already extensively grievance-laden relationship between the two realms. The Frost Giants were killed by the Vault's guardian before they could accomplish whatever they had come to accomplish, and the ceremony continued, and Odin made clear that the incident was closed, that it would not be escalated, that the careful, difficult, imperfect peace between Asgard and Jotunheim would hold. Thor could not accept this. The inability to accept it was not willful disobedience in the simple sense, not a conscious decision to disregard his father's judgment because his own felt superior. It was something more instinctive and more deeply rooted than that, a response that came from a level of his formation that rational instruction had not yet fully reached. The incursion felt to him like an insult, like a challenge to Asgard's honour that demanded immediate and overwhelming response, and the concept of honour in Asgard's warrior tradition was not a light thing, not a social nicety that could be set aside for pragmatic reasons without cost to something essential. He understood Odin's decision as a form of weakness, or at the very least as a form of patience that he did not yet have the wisdom to distinguish from weakness, and this misreading was itself the most precise possible expression of exactly what he still had to learn. He went to Jotunheim. He brought with him Loki and the Warriors 3 and Sif, companions who loved him well enough to follow him into a decision that some of them had reservations about, because that is what loyalty looks like when it has not yet been balanced by the willingness to refuse. The journey across the Bifrost, the rainbow bridge that Heimdall guards with the particular patient vigilance of someone who has stood at the same post for longer than most beings have existed, required Heimdall's cooperation. And Heimdall's cooperation was not simply given, but was produced by Thor's combination of authority and insistence, and the specific quality of certainty that he projected so completely that it made refusal feel somehow smaller than agreement. This is worth noting because Heimdall is not a fool, and is not easily persuaded, and the fact that Thor's confidence was compelling enough to move even him says something about how total that confidence was, and how thoroughly it had been mistaken for wisdom by everyone in his proximity, including in this moment himself. Jotunheim received them the way a realm receives uninvited guests who arrive with weapons and grievances, and the body language of people who have come to make a point rather than have a conversation. The initial moments had a quality of fragile, dangerous formality, the kind of standoff that might in other circumstances have been navigated toward an exit without catastrophe, if everyone involved had been approaching it with that goal. Thor was not approaching it with that goal. He was approaching it in the way he approached most things at this stage of his life. With his conclusion already formed and his actions oriented toward confirming that conclusion rather than examining it. When the Frost Giant's taunts reached the particular register that Asgardian honor culture designated as requiring physical response, he responded, and the battle that followed was the battle that Odin had specifically and explicitly said must not happen. The fighting itself was fierce and not without genuine peril. Frost giants are not weak or slow or easily overcome, and even Thor's considerable power was tested by their numbers and their cold, and the particular way that Jotunheim itself seemed to press against the intruders with a hostility that was almost environmental, as if the realm recognized the violation and participated in opposing it. The warriors Three and Sif fought with the loyalty and skill that had always characterized them, and Loki was present through all of it, with a quality of attention that was somewhat different from everyone else's, watching the consequences of the decision he had been part of making, with the particular stillness of someone who is storing what they are observing for future use. They would have died there, very possibly, without Odin's arrival. The All-Father came through the Bifrost with the controlled fury of a parent who is simultaneously terrified for a child's safety and devastated by that child's choices, a combination of emotional states that produces something colder and more measured than simple anger, because it has grief in it as well as rage. His presence changed the terms of the confrontation immediately and completely. The Frost Giants fell back. The battle stopped. And in the sudden quiet of Jotunheim's cold air, Odin looked at his son, and what passed between them in that look was everything that had been building toward this moment, across the whole of Thor's formation, all the patient investment of years of raising and teaching and hoping, and the specific and devastating recognition that the investment had not yet produced what it needed to produce. The journey back to Asgard and the conversation that followed in Odin's throne room had the quality of an event that both participants had been approaching for a long time without knowing it. Odin's words to Thor were not the words of a man enjoying his authority or relishing the correction of a subordinate who had overstepped. They were the words of someone who understood, with the clarity of very long experience, that the moment had arrived when the comfortable postponement of a necessary lesson could no longer be sustained without doing damage that would be far harder to repair than the damage the lesson itself would cause. He told his son what he was, not a warrior king whose power made him wise, not someone whose birthright had already produced the character it was designed to produce, someone who was proud and selfish and cruel in the particular way that people are cruel when they have never been required to think about the cost of their actions to those without the power to make them pay attention. The stripping of Thor's powers was not a punishment in the punitive sense, not a parent inflicting suffering on a child in order to communicate displeasure. It was something more deliberate and more compassionate than that, though it did not feel like compassion in the receiving of it. It was an intervention, a radical restructuring of the conditions of Thor's existence, designed to make it possible for him to learn something that the conditions of his previous existence had made it structurally impossible to learn. You cannot teach humility to someone who has never experienced powerlessness. You cannot teach compassion through instruction alone to someone who has never depended on the compassion of others for survival. The lesson that Odin needed his son to learn was not available in Asgard, in the environment of Thor's power and privilege, and the unquestioning affirmation of everyone around him. It had to be learned somewhere else, under different conditions, and Odin, with the particular ruthlessness of someone who loves a person enough to do something that will hurt them for their own eventual good, arranged for those conditions to exist. The enchantment placed on Mjolnir as it was hurled through the Bifrost, after its owner is one of the most resonant pieces of mythological writing in Marvel's long history, precisely because it is so simple and so complete. Whosoever holds this hammer, if they be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor. The enchantment does not define worthiness. It does not provide a checklist or a set of criteria that can be studied and satisfied. It simply names it, and in naming it without defining it, it places the determination of worthiness exactly where it belongs, in the living encounter between a person's character and the specific demands of a specific moment. This is a more sophisticated moral framework than it might initially appear, because it resists the kind of gaming that defined criteria invite, the approach of treating virtue as a performance calibrated to meet an external standard, rather than as a genuine orientation of the self toward the needs of others. Thor arrived on Earth without grace. The transition from all-powerful Asgardian prince to ordinary, powerless, bewildered man in the New Mexico desert was not a gentle one, and he did not receive it gently. He was confused and loud and insistent in ways that were, in the context of his new environment, more comic than impressive. The specific comedy of someone whose entire self-presentation has been calibrated for an audience that is no longer present. The people who found him, Jane Foster and Eric Selvig and Darcy Lewis, were scientists engaged in the study of atmospheric anomalies, which meant they were precisely the kind of people likely to respond to the sudden appearance of a very large, very confused man in the desert with something between professional curiosity and cautious skepticism, rather than with the awe he was accustomed to. Jane Foster, as the comics have developed her across decades of storytelling, is one of the more consistently underestimated characters in Thor's mythology, underestimated both by the people around her within the stories and occasionally by the narratives that contain her, though the best versions of her story do not make this mistake. She is brilliant and driven and possessed of a particular quality of intellectual courage, the willingness to follow evidence into conclusions that the established consensus of her field has not yet reached, that makes her both a formidable scientist and someone whose emotional intelligence tends to operate with similar courage and directness. She did not fall for Thor because he was magnificent, though he was. She fell for him in the gradual way that the best versions of this relationship depict, because of what she began to see in him as the experience of powerlessness started its slow and necessary work on his character. The early days on Earth had a quality that Thor himself would later recognize as essential, though in the living of them they felt primarily like deprivation. He had no hammer, he had no power, he had no throne or hall or warriors around him who knew his name and its weight. He had the clothes he stood in and the confusion of someone whose entire framework for understanding himself had been removed along with the specific abilities that framework depended on. In this condition, stripped of everything that had previously defined him, he was required to encounter other people as they actually were rather than as subjects or subordinates or opponents, required to depend on the kindness of strangers in ways that were new and uncomfortable and quietly revolutionary in their effect on his understanding of what it meant to need someone. The search for Mjolnir was, for a time, the organizing principle of his existence on Earth, the goal around which his reduced circumstances arranged themselves. The hammer had landed in the desert not far from where he had arrived, and the government agency that had quickly cordoned off the site and taken possession of the object represented an obstacle that Thor in his full power would have walked through without thought, and that Thor in his current condition could not overcome. The failure to lift the hammer, the moment when he put his hands on it and it did not move, was the most psychologically significant event of his exile, more significant even than the exile itself, because it was the moment when the external world confirmed what some part of him was only beginning to suspect. He was not, in his current state, worthy. The hammer knew it before he did, and its stillness communicated the knowledge with a finality that no argument could address. What followed this failure was not an immediate transformation of character, but the beginning of something that would eventually become one. The grief that came with the hammer's refusal was real and deep and not to be minimized, because what Thor lost when he lost his powers was not merely capability but identity, not merely strength, but the entire structure of meaning that strength had provided. He did not know in those early days on Earth who he was without the hammer and the lightning and the title. He had never been asked to find out. The asking, which came in the form of his father's enchantment and the New Mexico desert and the patient, curious attention of a scientist who was interested in him as a person, rather than as a legend, was the beginning of the answer, though the answer would take considerably longer than the exile itself to fully articulate. The world he'd fallen into was small by Asgardian standards, and this smallness was, as it turned out, one of its most important qualities. The diner where he ate breakfast with Jane and her colleagues, the quiet evenings in the temporary accommodation that local people arranged for him, with the casual generosity of communities that have not yet learned to be suspicious of strangers, the conversations that happened in ordinary places about ordinary things, conversations in which he was not a prince or a god, but simply a very large, very confused man who was clearly trying to make sense of circumstances he had not chosen. In this smallness, in the unhurried domestic texture of ordinary human life, something began to shift in Thor that the grandeur of Asgard had never provided sufficient space for. He began, slowly and without quite knowing that it was happening, to look outward rather than inward, to notice what other people needed rather than what he deserved, to feel the specific weight of a world that was fragile and temporary and doing its best, and to understand that this weight was not a burden to be dismissed but a responsibility to be honoured. The hammer sat in the desert and did not move, and in its stillness it contained more wisdom than most objects accumulate across their entire existence. This is worth sitting with for a moment, the image of Mjolnir at rest in the New Mexico earth. Surrounded by the careful fencing and institutional attention of people who understood that they were dealing with something extraordinary, without having any framework for understanding what that something was. The government agents catalogued it, and photographed it, and attempted to lift it with machinery that would have moved a building, and it remained where it was with the serene, unhurried patience of something that is not waiting, because it is indifferent, but because it understands that the right moment has not yet arrived. This patience was not passive. It was one of the most active forces in Thor's story during this period, because the knowledge of the hammer's presence and the knowledge of his inability to reach it created a specific kind of pressure on his exile that accelerated certain processes in his character that might otherwise have taken much longer to develop. The question of what worthiness actually means is one that the enchantment raises without answering. And this refusal to answer is not a gap in the mythology, but its most important feature. Odin did not specify what would constitute worthiness, because worthiness is not a fixed destination that can be reached by following a set of directions. It is a quality of orientation, a way of being in relation to power and to the people over whom one has power, that cannot be performed or strategically adopted, but must be genuinely developed through the kind of experience that changes not just behaviour but the internal landscape from which behaviour grows. Any definition specific enough to be actionable would immediately become a standard to be gamed, and the entire point of the enchantment was to prevent exactly that kind of gaming, to make it impossible for Thor to decide that he had satisfied the criteria and therefore deserved his hammer back, because the moment that calculating deserving logic is in operation, the thing being sought has already been missed. This is a more demanding moral framework than most systems of reward and punishment employ, and it is worth examining why, because understanding it illuminates something essential about the kind of hero Thor was in the process of becoming. Most systems of consequence are legible from within themselves. You do the thing, you receive the outcome. The relationship between action and result is clear enough that it can be managed, and this manageability is precisely what makes such systems only partial tools for the development of genuine character. They can shape behaviour without transforming the person doing the behaving, can produce compliance without producing understanding, can make someone act as though they have learned something without the learning having actually occurred at any depth that matters. Odin's enchantment refused this partial solution. It asked not for behavioural adjustment, but for genuine transformation, not for Thor to act like someone worthy, but to become someone worthy, and it provided no guidance on how to do this, because guidance on how to do this would have undermined the doing of it. The comic's long history of exploring who has proven worthy enough to lift Mjolnir is one of the richest and most philosophically generous threads in the entire Marvel tapestry, precisely because each instance of worthiness reveals something different about what the concept contains. Beta Ray Bill, the alien warrior whose encounter with the hammer comes later in Thor's story, and whose own worthiness is one of the most significant events in Thor's education about himself, demonstrated that worthiness was not bounded by species or origin, or any form of Asgardian hereditary claim. His ability to lift the hammer was not a mistake or an anomaly, but a revelation, the enchantment working exactly as intended, recognizing in this strange and powerful being from another part of the cosmos the qualities that the enchantment was designed to find regardless of what container they arrived in. Captain America's ability to lift Mjolnir, glimpsed at various moments across Marvel's history and confirmed with full dramatic weight during the events of one of the Avengers' most desperate battles, communicates something different but equally important about the nature of worthiness. Rogers is not a god. He does not possess the physical power that Thor was born with, nor the centuries of accumulated experience, nor the cosmic heritage that might seem, from one angle, like a prerequisite for the kind of worthiness the hammer requires. What he possesses is something simpler and more fundamental, a quality of moral integrity so consistent and so deeply seated that it operates the same way regardless of the circumstances pressing on it, not as a performance of virtue calibrated to the expectations of observers, but as the natural expression of a self that has been built around certain values and cannot be separated from them without ceasing to be itself. The hammer recognizes this quality without caring about the package it comes in, and in doing so it articulates what Odin's enchantment was always intended to articulate, that the power of Thor is not Asgardian power, but the power that belongs to anyone who is genuinely worthy of it. Jane Foster's worthiness, which arrives much later in the story, and which will receive the full attention it deserves in a later passage, is perhaps the most emotionally devastating and most philosophically complete expression of what the enchantment means, because she lifts the hammer at the precise moment when doing so costs her the most, when the transformation into Thor actively accelerates her illness, when choosing to be worthy is choosing to die more quickly, when the enchantment is asking not for someone who is willing to be powerful, but for someone who is willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of others, even when they are also fighting for their own survival. This is worthiness at its most absolute, most stripped of any ambiguity about motivation or self-interest, and the hammer's recognition of it is the most complete expression of what Odin was reaching for when he created the enchantment in the first place. Thor, lying in the New Mexico desert in the days following his failed attempt to retrieve his hammer, was not yet any of these things. He was something earlier in the process, something that contained the potential for worthiness, without yet having been shaped by the specific experiences that would allow that potential to actualize. He was still, in many ways, the same person who had walked into Jotunheim with the warrior's certainty that decisive action was its own justification. The exile had removed his power, but had not yet fully removed the assumptions that had been built alongside his power across a lifetime of being the most capable person in every room he entered. These assumptions are not dissolved by a single confrontation with powerlessness, however dramatic. They loosen, gradually, as the new conditions of existence accumulate their evidence, and the old framework for making sense of things becomes increasingly inadequate to the actual experience of the present moment. What began to shift in Thor during his time in the desert town, in the days following the failed retrieval of Mjolnir, was his attention. This seems like a small thing, and in some ways it is the smallest possible thing, a mere reorientation of where one looks. But in another sense it is the most fundamental change available to a person, because where attention goes, everything else eventually follows. Thor had spent his entire life with his attention, organized primarily around himself, around his own capabilities and his own judgments, and his own sense of how situations should be resolved, and what honor required, and what power entitled him to. This is not unusual for someone of his formation. It is, in fact, almost exactly what his formation was designed to produce. The reorientation that the exile made possible was the slow, unforced, experience-driven movement of his attention outward, toward the people around him, toward their needs and their concerns and the texture of their daily lives, which turned out to be considerably more interesting and considerably more worthy of respect than his previous framework had led him to anticipate. Jane Foster was a significant part of this reorientation, not because she instructed him in humility or confronted him with his failings, but because she was genuinely, unperformatively interested in the world in ways that were contagious to someone paying attention. Her scientific curiosity, her willingness to follow evidence into conclusions that her field's consensus had not yet reached, her combination of intellectual rigor and genuine wonder at the phenomena she studied, these qualities made her someone whose company produced a particular kind of alertness in those around her, an aliveness to the possibility that the world contained more than one's existing categories had accounted for. For Thor, whose existing categories had been both extensive and somewhat rigidly organized. This was a form of education that arrived without announcing itself as such, which is almost certainly the only form of education that would have worked on him at this stage. The ordinary people of the small New Mexico town provided a different kind of lesson, one that was perhaps even more important in the long run, because it was less filtered through personal connection, and therefore more purely about the general fact of human life and human dignity. These were people without cosmic significance, without powers or titles or the kind of history that gets remembered across millennia. They had jobs and families and the specific, unremarkable courage of people who get up every morning and do what the day requires of them without any expectation that this effort will be acknowledged or celebrated. Thor had never had occasion to look at this kind of life carefully before. In Asgard, the frame through which he understood the world sorted people and things by their relationship to power, and ordinary mortals in that frame registered as small. The experience of living among them, of depending on their hospitality and receiving their care without having anything to offer them in return except his presence, and gradually his genuine gratitude began to rearrange that frame in ways that he could feel happening without yet being able to fully articulate. The moment of worthiness, when it came, didn't arrive as the culmination of a completed process, but as the recognition of a sufficient one. This distinction is important because the completed process, the one in which Thor has resolved all of his contradictions and achieved a stable, permanent wisdom, is not actually available in a lifetime of any finite length, let alone in the span of a single exile. What became available was something more modest and more real, a genuine reorientation of his deepest motivations, away from the self-aggrandizing logic of honor and glory and towards something closer to actual care for actual people, demonstrated not through declaration, but through the specific action of being willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of others with no calculation about what the sacrifice would cost him. The threat that arrived in the form of the Destroyer, the enormous armoured automaton that Loki had sent from Asgard to ensure that Thor's exile was permanent, served as the crucible for this reorientation. The Destroyer is not a subtle instrument. It is power without conscience, strength without any of the qualities that worthiness is made of, and in this sense it was a perfect mirror for what Thor had been before his exile. It moved through the town with the unstoppable momentum of something that has no reason to stop, and the people in its path had no means of meeting it. Thor's response to this situation, stripped of his power and facing something that could destroy him and the people around him with equal ease, contained the answer to the question the enchantment had been asking. He did not fight to win. He could not win, powerless as he was, and he knew it. He walked toward the Destroyer because the alternative was to allow it to harm people who could not protect themselves, and in that moment the calculation that had governed his earlier life, the one that weighed honour and glory and the implications for his own story, was simply absent. What was present was something much quieter and much more durable, the uncomplicated recognition that the people behind him needed protecting, and that he was the only one who could provide it, and that this was sufficient reason to do what the moment required regardless of what it cost him. This is worthiness. Not as a concept or a standard or a point on a scale, but as a lived experience, a moment in which the self and its concerns step back far enough that what remains is simply the need in front of you and the response it calls for. Mjolnir moved. The hammer that had sat in the desert earth through all the machinery and all the trying and all the frustrated institutional bafflement lifted and flew across the desert and returned to the hand that had always been its home. Not because Thor had become a different person in any simple sense, but because the person he had always had the potential to be had finally arrived at the surface, and the enchantment recognized the arrival with the patient, unhurried accuracy of something that had been waiting exactly this long and no longer. The return of his powers in that moment was not a restoration but a transformation. He did not get back what he had lost. He received something different and better. The same capabilities now inhabited by a self that had been genuinely changed by the experience of not having them, that understood their weight and their cost in ways that the earlier Thor, for whom they had simply been the natural condition of existence, could not have understood. The thunder that came back to him was the same thunder, the lightning was the same lightning, but the hand that held the hammer was steadier, and the heart behind the hand was quieter and more certain in a way that had nothing to do with confidence, and everything to do with the specific peace that comes from knowing, not from having been told but from having lived through the evidence, who you are and what you are for. The journey back toward Asgard that followed was not the end of the education but the end of its first and most foundational phase. Thor had learned, in the way that only experience can teach, the difference between power and worthiness, between the capability to affect events and the character that determines whether that capability serves something beyond itself. He carried this learning forward not as a completed achievement but as an orientation, a way of approaching the world that would be tested and refined and sometimes lost sight of, and recovered again across everything that followed. The hammer was back in his hand, the lightning was back in his voice, and the god of thunder who rose from that New Mexico desert was, in every way that mattered, a genuinely different god from the one who had been cast down from Asgard days before. The god who returned from exile carried something that no victory in Asgard had ever given him, and no amount of time in the Golden Halls would have produced on its own. It was not a quality that announced itself, or that could be easily named in the vocabulary that warrior cultures tend to develop for the things they value. It was closer to a kind of permeability, an openness to the world outside himself that the earlier Thor, sealed within the comfortable certainty of his own power and significance, had not possessed and had not known he lacked. He moved through Asgard differently in the months following his return, and the people who knew him best noticed the difference without always being able to articulate precisely what had changed. He was quieter. He listened in a way he had not listened before, with the quality of attention that suggests genuine interest in what will be said rather than the patient endurance of speech before the opportunity to respond. He asked questions that he would previously have answered himself before they were fully formed. These are small changes, the kind that do not make dramatic stories, and yet they are the changes that everything else is eventually built on. The dual identity of Donald Blake, which the earliest Marvel comics used as the framework for Thor's existence on Earth, deserves attention both for what it was and for what it represented thematically in the long arc of his story. In those original 1962 issues, Thor did not arrive on Earth as himself, but discovered himself through the mechanism of a mortal alter ego, a physician named Donald Blake, who found a wooden walking stick in a Norwegian cave and struck it against a rock to discover that he had somehow always been the god of thunder. The mortal form a kind of chrysalis or concealment that Odin had arranged to teach his son the lesson of human limitation from the inside. Blake was lame, dependent on his walking stick, practicing medicine in a world where he was unremarkable by most measures, and this arrangement was Odin's most elaborate and most intimate experiment in enforced humility. The All-Father's conviction that a god could not truly understand the value of mortal life without having lived inside it. The Donald Blake framework was eventually set aside as Marvel's storytelling evolved, and as the demands of continuity and character development made the dual identity increasingly difficult to sustain without it becoming a limitation rather than an enrichment. But the emotional truth it was reaching for persisted through every subsequent version of Thor's relationship with Earth and its people. The fundamental question it raised, what does it mean for an immortal being to genuinely love a world of people who will die before he finishes mourning them, remained one of the central questions of Thor's story long after the specific mechanism of Donald Blake had been retired from active use. It is a question that gains rather than loses resonance with time, because the longer Thor lives among mortals and the more he loves specific mortal people, the more acutely the asymmetry of their existences becomes felt, and the more extraordinary his continued choice to invest in those relationships becomes. Jane Foster's place in Thor's story across the decades of comics history is more complex and more honourable than a summary characterisation of her as a romantic interest would suggest, and the comics at their best have understood this, even if they did not always act on that understanding consistently. She arrived in the original stories as a nurse in Donald Blake's medical practice, which already positioned her in a role defined by care and service to others, a characterization that was partly a reflection of the period's limited imagination about women's professional possibilities, but that also contained, in its emphasis on her commitment to healing, a genuine value that the later development of her character was able to build on authentically. Her intelligence and her courage were present in those early stories, though not always given the room they deserved, and the trajectory of her character across the decades moved steadily toward a fuller realization of the qualities that had always been latent in the original conception. The romantic relationship between Thor and Jane that developed across those early years was significant not primarily as romance, but as education on both sides. Jane offered Thor something that his Asgardian experience had not provided, a model of commitment to others that was not organized around power or hierarchy or the warrior culture's specific economy of honor and obligation. Her care for her patients, her intellectual dedication to understanding the world accurately, her willingness to act on her convictions in the face of skepticism from people with more institutional authority, These were forms of heroism that did not look like heroism by the standards of Asgard's tradition, and that were therefore genuinely new information for Thor, genuinely expanding his understanding of what it meant to do something admirable and worthwhile with the life one had been given. Thor, for his part, offered Jane a window into a scale of existence that was simultaneously overwhelming and clarifying. The perspective of someone for whom human history is not a series of events to be studied, but a lived experience across which certain patterns have become visible that are not visible from within the span of a single human life. His understanding of time, of loss, of the recurring nature of certain kinds of struggle and the recurring possibility of certain kinds of renewal, gave their conversations a quality that Jane found both challenging and sustaining, the quality of talking with someone whose orientation toward the world is so genuinely different from one's own that it expands rather than confirms what one already thinks. The tension between Asgard and Earth that became one of the defining structural features of Thor's ongoing story was not simply logistical, not merely a matter of scheduling conflicts between his various obligations. It was an expression of a genuine and irresolvable tension within his identity itself, between the parts of him that were irreducibly Asgardian, shaped by centuries of that culture's values and relationships and responsibilities, and the parts of him that had been formed, and were continuing to be formed, by his engagement with the mortal world and its very different claims on his attention and affection. Neither world could be simply set aside in favour of the other without a genuine loss of something essential, and Thor spent much of his early career on Earth managing this tension with varying degrees of grace, sometimes succeeding in holding both sets of obligations together with the kind of creative integration that produces something better than either component alone, and sometimes failing in ways that cost him on one side or the other of the divide. The Warriors 3 and Sif remained constant presences in his life during this period, moving between Asgard and Earth, with the particular ease of people whose loyalty is to a person rather than to a place, and who therefore go where that person goes without requiring extensive justification. Their presence provided continuity and familiarity in a life that was in many ways defined by constant transition, by the movement between worlds and between aspects of identity that the dual demands of his existence required. Volstag's warmth and Fandrel's wit, and Hogun's steadiness, and Sif's clear-eyed, challenging affection created around Thor a small community of people who knew him well enough to both celebrate and critique him, which is perhaps the most useful kind of community anyone can have. Sif's relationship with Thor deserves particular attention in the context of his early career on Earth, because it was one of the more honest and more complicated relationships in his life during this period, shaped by genuine mutual respect and genuine mutual feeling, and the specific difficulty of two people who have known each other long enough to see each other clearly, and who do not always find the clarity comfortable. She loved him with the directness characteristic of someone who had never been able to afford the luxury of indirection, someone who had fought for every acknowledgement she had received, and had therefore learned the value of saying plainly what she meant. Her concerns about his attachment to Earth and to mortal people were not jealousy in any simple sense, but something more thoughtful than that, a genuine worry about what it would cost him, in the very long run, to love people who could not love him back across the same span of time. The early villains who populated his career on Earth during this period had a quality that reflected the particular anxieties of the era in which they were created, the 1960s and 70s, when the intersection of atomic age technology and Cold War politics produced a specific cultural imagination about what danger looked like and where it came from. The absorbing man, Karl Creel, was given his powers by Loki, and was in many ways a blunt instrument in the God of Mischief's more complicated schemes, someone who could absorb the properties of whatever he touched, and who therefore functioned as a kind of mirror of the environment, taking on the qualities of the world around him with the passivity of a person who has never developed any stable qualities of his own. His encounters with Thor had the quality of object lessons in the difference between power that originates in one's own character and power that is borrowed from one's surroundings. The Wrecker and the Wrecking Crew arrived in Thor's world through the specifically human story of a man whose frustration at his circumstances had curdled into a conviction that the world owed him something it had failed to deliver, and who had acquired cosmic power through a misunderstanding in a hotel room that was, in its way, one of the funnier origin stories in Marvel's extensive catalogue, while also being a surprisingly honest portrait of how certain kinds of dangerous people come to be. Dirk Garthwaite was not extraordinary. He had no particular gifts, no special destiny, no relationship to the cosmic forces whose power he accidentally acquired. He simply had a crowbar and a great deal of resentment, and these turned out to be sufficient to make him a persistent problem for a god, which is itself a quietly interesting observation about the relationship between power and purpose. What Thor's engagement with these early enemies taught him, accumulated across dozens of conflicts over the years of his initial integration into Earth's heroic community, was something that his training in Asgard had not, and could not have taught him, because the lesson required opponents who were specifically human in their motivations, even when they possessed inhuman capabilities. He learned to read frustration and resentment, and the specific anger that comes from feeling invisible and unvalued, not as weakness to be overcome or dismissed, but as a condition that demanded a particular kind of attention, a recognition that the same forces that drove people toward destructive choices were forces that could, under different circumstances, have driven them toward something else. This is not a lesson that produces simple solutions. It does not make Thor more effective at stopping any individual criminal in the immediate sense, but it made him a more complete hero in the deeper sense, someone whose response to the people he fought was informed by an understanding of what had made them who they were, and whose victories therefore carried the moral weight that genuine heroism requires. The integration into Earth's broader heroic community that came with the formation of the Avengers added a new dimension to Thor's ongoing education in what it meant to be a hero in a world not organized around Asgardian values. His relationships with Tony Stark and Steve Rogers were shaped by the same fundamental dynamic that shaped all of his important relationships during this period, the encounter between his Asgardian formation and sensibilities, and the very different formation and sensibilities of people who had arrived at heroism through entirely different paths. Stark's intelligence was of a piece with his character in ways that Thor found genuinely interesting, the way that exceptional capability and a certain kind of wounded pride were woven together in him into something both impressive and occasionally exasperating. Rogers he respected with the particular respect that one genuine moral seriousness has for another, recognizing in the smaller man something of the same orientation towards service and sacrifice that his own exile had been working to produce in him. The question of what it means to choose a world, to commit to a place and its people, with the knowledge that the commitment will outlast almost everyone in it, became more rather than less pressing as Thor's years on Earth accumulated. Each person he knew who aged and died and passed out of the story he was living inside was both a loss and a deepening of his understanding of why the commitment mattered. The brevity of mortal life, which from a certain cosmic perspective might seem like an argument against deep investment in mortal relationships, turned out on lived experience to be one of the most compelling arguments for such investment, because the brevity made every moment of genuine connection more rather than less significant, gave it a weight and a preciousness that immortal existence, in its endless extension, could not automatically produce. Thor chose Earth, repeatedly, across every version of his story that Marvel's storytelling has produced, and the choice is never accidental or incidental or explained away by romantic attachment alone. It is something more considered and more essential than that. The choice of a being who has seen enough of the cosmos to understand that the small, fragile, temporary world spinning in its unremarkable corner of the galaxy contains something that the grander realms, for all their magnificence, do not always manage to sustain. What it contains is the quality of life lived close to its own limits, life that knows it is finite and chooses, despite that knowledge or perhaps because of it, to invest fully in love and work and the attempt to leave things slightly better than they were found. Thor had been trying to learn how to do this all his life. On Earth, among mortals who did it without thinking, he found his best classroom. To understand Loki's long campaign against his brother. It helps to resist the temptation to begin the story where it becomes most visible, at the schemes and the betrayals and the elaborate constructions of mischief that fill the decades of their conflict, and to begin instead where the story actually begins, in the place that all the schemes were growing from, in the silence between two brothers in a hall that was large enough for both of them, and that somehow never quite felt that way. The mischief came later. The motivation came first, and the motivation was not simple, and doing it the disservice of reducing it to envy or ambition, or the straightforward desire for power, would be to miss the most honest and the most enduring thing about Loki's story, which is that it is, underneath all its elaborate surface architecture, a story about the specific damage done by love that arrives in the wrong form at the wrong time, in a context that does not know how to receive it. Loki was the first villain of the Avengers. This is a fact worth pausing over, not because it establishes his credentials as a significant antagonist, though it certainly does that, but because of what it reveals about the structure of his imagination and the specific quality of the chaos he tended to generate. He did not set out to create the Avengers, he set out to destroy Thor, or more precisely to humiliate Thor. Which in the psychology of someone who has spent a lifetime in the shadow of a brother's uncomplicated glory is a more specific and more revealing goal than simple destruction. Destruction ends things. Humiliation restructures them, demonstrates that the thing everyone admired was not what they thought it was, forces a public recalibration of a reputation that had always felt to Loki like it was taking up too much of the available light. What he achieved instead was the assembly of Earth's greatest heroes into a team that would become one of the most formidable forces in the Marvel Universe, which is the kind of outcome that only someone with Loki's particular genius for unintended consequences could have produced from a plan that was, in its original conception, straightforwardly petty. The scheme involved the Hulk and a manipulated radio signal, and the particular assumption that a problem large enough and frightening enough would draw Thor out of whatever corner of Earth's heroic landscape he was currently occupying, and bring him into a confrontation that Loki could control. What it actually did was draw out Tony Stark and Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne, and eventually Steve Rogers when the relevant timing aligned, and the collection of remarkable people who gathered around the problem that Loki had created decided, in the aftermath of its resolution, that gathering had been a good idea worth continuing. The Avengers were, in a very real sense, Loki's inadvertent creation, and this irony is one that he would have found unbearable if he had allowed himself to sit with it, which is perhaps why his subsequent schemes tended to become more elaborate rather than more reflective. The pattern that defined Loki's scheming across the decades of their conflict was consistent enough to constitute a kind of signature, and understanding the pattern is more illuminating than cataloguing the individual schemes, because the pattern reveals what was actually being sought beneath the surface of each specific plan. Loki's plots were almost never straightforwardly about acquiring a particular object, or achieving a particular territorial control, or any of the other concrete goals that simpler villains organized their activities around. They were about demonstrating something, about forcing a recognition that Loki felt he had never adequately received, about making the world acknowledge, through whatever means were available, that he was not merely the shadow beside the light, but a significant force in his own right. The elaborate quality of his constructions, the layers of misdirection and the nested deceptions and the contingencies built into contingencies were not simply tactical, they were expressive. They were the work of someone showing what he could do with the one form of power that Asgard had never quite learned to celebrate the way it celebrated Thor's. His intelligence, applied to his conflict with Thor, produced plans of genuinely impressive sophistication, and it is worth acknowledging this without apology. Because one of the things that makes Loki such a rich and enduring figure is that his capabilities are real. He's not a villain who is defeated because his plans are foolish or his execution sloppy. He is a villain who is defeated when he is defeated, because the thing he is fundamentally trying to achieve, recognition, validation, the restructuring of a relationship that has never been quite right, is not available through the methods he has chosen to pursue it, and no amount of tactical brilliance can compensate for a strategy that is oriented toward the wrong goal. He could outthink almost anyone in the Marvel Universe, and frequently did. And the victories this produced were always ultimately hollow in the specific way that victories are hollow when they do not address the actual want that motivated them. The moments when Loki came closest to genuine redemption are worth examining carefully, because they reveal more about his actual character than any of his villainous episodes do, and because they demonstrate that the person capable of the mischief was also, underneath it, someone capable of something very different. These moments were not rare anomalies in an otherwise consistent pattern of antagonism. They were recurring features of his story, appearing with enough regularity across enough different creative teams and enough different versions of his character that they cannot be dismissed as sentimentality or inconsistency, but must be understood as expressions of something real in the character's foundation. There were times when Loki allied himself with Thor against threats that were larger and more genuinely dangerous than his own ambitions, and the quality he demonstrated in these alliances was not the careful, calculating cooperation of someone making a tactical judgment about temporary advantage. It was something that looked, in those moments, genuinely like the brother he might have been under different circumstances, capable and committed and possessed of a particular fierce loyalty to Thor that expressed itself in exactly the way Thor's loyalty expressed itself, through showing up and doing what the moment required regardless of personal cost. These moments did not hold. They were always followed by a return to the older patterns, as if the infrastructure of his relationship with his own identity was not yet sufficiently rebuilt to sustain the new behaviour for longer than the immediate crisis demanded. The tragedy of Loki's near redemptions is not that they were false. They were genuine in the moment of their occurrence, which is precisely what makes their failure to hold so heartbreaking. They were genuine expressions of a self that existed beneath the performed mischief and the elaborately constructed persona of the trickster god, a self that had been formed by the same love and the same Asgardian upbringing, and the same relationship with Thor that the antagonistic self had been formed by, but that had not received sufficient nurturing or acknowledgement to develop into something stable. The conditions that would have been necessary for that self to become the dominant one were conditions that Loki's life had not provided, and the moments of redemption were glimpses of what might have been, rather than the establishment of what would be. The Enchantress and the Executioner, who moved through the margins of Loki's schemes with their own motivations and their own agendas, represent the broader ecosystem of antagonism that grew up around Thor's career, partly through Loki's influence, and partly through the independent operation of Asgardian politics, and the particular way that power and resentment generated each other in the corridors of the Golden City. Amora, the Enchantress, possessed a form of magical capability that rivaled Loki's in certain respects and exceeded it in others, and her obsessive fixation on Thor, which expressed itself alternately as desire and as the specific fury of desire that has been consistently refused, gave her schemes a personal quality that was distinct from Loki's more philosophical antagonism. Scourge, the Executioner, was something sadder and simpler, someone whose tremendous physical power was consistently deployed in service of someone else's goals because he had never developed the internal resources to imagine a different kind of story for himself, and whose eventual moment of genuine heroism, standing alone at the bridge of Jarlabru to cover his comrade's retreat, is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in Thor's entire mythology. The introduction of Malekith the Accursed into Loki's orbit, and into Thor's story more broadly, represented the arrival of a different kind of darkness, one that was less interested in the psychological dynamics of sibling rivalry and more interested in the straightforward project of making all existence worse in ways that would benefit whatever passed for Malekith's interests in any given moment. If Loki's malice was always shadowed by love, always in some deep sense about the relationship with Thor and the wound that relationship contained, Malekith's was uncomplicated by any such ambivalence. He was cruel the way that certain very old things are cruel, not from frustration or hurt or the specific damage of feeling unseen, but from a settled orientation toward destruction that had outlasted whatever might once have motivated it and become simply what he was. His scheming and Loki's scheming intersected and diverged and occasionally produced unholy alliances whose consequences took years to fully unfold. Thor's love for Loki, maintained through all of it, through every betrayal and every scheme and every moment when the evidence argued most forcefully that the love was wasted, is perhaps the most psychologically precise thing about him. It would be easier to understand and certainly easier to defend if it were simply blind, if Thor continued loving his brother out of a failure to see clearly what his brother repeatedly did. But it was not blind, and this is crucial. Thor saw Loki clearly. He understood the damage that Loki caused and the malice that motivated it, and the pattern that made each apparent reformation suspect. He loved him anyway, not because he had decided to ignore the evidence, but because he understood, at some level that operated beneath conscious reasoning, that the damage Loki caused was inseparable from the damage Loki had sustained, and that responding to the former without acknowledging the latter was not justice but simply a different kind of cruelty. This love was not passive acceptance or the abdication of moral judgment. Thor was willing to fight Loki, to oppose him, to confine him when necessary, and to grieve for the lives that his brother's schemes had cost. He did all of these things without pretending that the love was absent, and this combination of clear-eyed opposition and genuine affection is one of the most mature emotional stances in Marvel's entire mythology, more sophisticated than either simple forgiveness or simple condemnation, more honest than either sentimentality or cynicism about what a relationship this damaged and this durable actually contains. The philosophical dimension of their conflict, which became increasingly explicit as the storytelling around them matured across the decades, was ultimately about two different responses to the same foundational experience of not being seen. Thor's response, shaped by the specific way his exile and his education had processed his own previously unexamined assumptions, was to turn the experience of not being seen into a practice of seeing others more carefully, to let the wound of his exile become the origin of a greater openness and attentiveness to the world around him. Loki's response, shaped by a wound that arrived earlier and went deeper and was never adequately addressed, was to insist on being seen through means that inevitably prevented the kind of seeing he actually needed, to demand acknowledgement through schemes that ensured the acknowledgement would always be of the wrong thing. They were, in this sense, each other's most important teachers, the relationship in which each learned the most essential things about themselves, and this is true regardless of how much pain the curriculum cost both of them. Thor became the hero he eventually became partly in response to his relationship with Loki, in the sustained encounter with someone whose suffering he could see, and whose choices he could not endorse, and whose love he could not stop feeling, and the wisdom this produced in him was wisdom that no amount of martial training or cosmic adventure could have generated on its own. The god of thunder swinging his hammer across the 9 realms was always, at some level, also a brother trying to find the right way to love someone who made loving him very difficult. And the grace with which he carried both of these identities simultaneously is one of the deepest sources of his enduring appeal. There is a word in the Norse mythological tradition that carries more weight than most single words are asked to bear, a word that names not just an event, but a cosmological certainty, not just an ending, but the specific kind of ending that contains within itself the conditions for what comes after, Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the twilight of a civilization so old and so magnificent that its destruction seems impossible right up until the moment it becomes inevitable, and then seems, in retrospect, to have been approaching for longer than anyone was willing to acknowledge. In the original Norse tradition, Ragnarok is not a possibility or a threat, but a prophecy, something woven into the structure of existence itself, known in advance, mourned in advance, and yet incapable of being prevented by any amount of foreknowledge or preparation. The gods of Asgard know that Ragnarok is coming. They know roughly how it will unfold. They know who will die and how and at whose hands, and they prepare for battle anyway, which is perhaps the most honest thing the Norse mythological imagination ever produced about what courage actually means. Marvel Comics inherited this concept and did something with it that was simultaneously faithful to the source material and deeply inventive in its own right, finding in the Ragnarok cycle not just a dramatic set piece, but a recurring thematic structure through which Thor's story could examine its most fundamental questions about identity, continuity, and the nature of heroism in the face of inevitable loss. The Ragnarok of the Marvel Universe is not a single event that happens once and is finished. It is a cycle, something that has happened before and will happen again, a wheel of destruction and renewal that the Asgardians are trapped within, doomed to repeat the same catastrophe at regular intervals, because the forces that drive it are not historical but cosmological, woven into the fabric of what Asgard is and what its mythology requires. The Walt Simonson era of Thor comics, which ran through much of the 1980s and which remains one of the most celebrated creative periods in the character's long history, engaged with the Ragnarok concept in ways that were both epic in scale and intimate in their attention to what the cycle meant for the specific people caught within it. Simonson understood that the power of Ragnarok as a narrative device was not primarily in the destruction it depicted, though the destruction was rendered with genuine grandeur and genuine weight, but in the specific quality of dread that accompanied the knowledge of approaching doom among people who had chosen to face it with open eyes. His version of the story gave the concept an emotional texture that made the cosmic feel personal, and this quality of personalizing the cosmic without diminishing either the personal or the cosmic is perhaps the defining characteristic of his achievement. The J. Michael Straczynski era, which arrived in the early years of the 2000s and which brought its own distinctive sensibility to Thor's mythology, engaged with Ragnarok as something that had already happened, exploring the aftermath of the cycle's completion and the question of what it meant to rebuild after a destruction so total that almost nothing survived it. His Thor returned to a world that had been emptied of Asgardians, a world in which the Golden City and all its inhabitants existed only in the memory of a single god who had to decide whether the rebuilding was worth attempting and what form it should take. This version of the Ragnarok story was less about the event itself and more about the morning after, about the quality of will required to look at total loss and choose, anyway, to begin again. Jason Aaron's run, which began in the early 2010s and which constitutes perhaps the most ambitious and most sustained engagement with Thor's mythology in the character's entire publication history, wove the Ragnarok concept through a decade of storytelling in ways that made it simultaneously the background condition of the narrative and its most pressing foreground concern. His version of the cycle was haunted by the figure of Gorr the God Butcher, whose arrival in the story raised the question of whether the cycle was not just inevitable but deserved, whether gods who allowed the destruction of their people through their own negligence and indifference had forfeited the right to renewal. This is a darker and more honest engagement with the concept than most superhero mythologies are willing to attempt, and it produced in Aaron's run a meditation on divine responsibility that gave the Ragnarok cycle a moral weight it had not always carried in its earlier Marvel incarnations. To understand why the cycle repeats, it helps to understand what drives it, and what drives it in Marvel's telling is the accumulation of the same qualities that drove the first catastrophe, pride and certainty, and the specific blindness of civilizations that have been powerful long enough to mistake their power for permanence. Asgard falls, in its various iterations, not simply because Surtur is strong, or because Loki schemes, or because the forces arrayed against it are more than any civilization could withstand. It falls because the qualities that made it magnificent, its confidence in its own rightness, its conviction that it occupied a privileged position in the cosmic order, its tendency to manage rather than acknowledge the grievances of those it has wronged, create the conditions for its own destruction with the patient logic of unaddressed problems that eventually become overwhelming crises. Surtur, the fire demon of Muspelheim, is the most ancient and most patient antagonist in Thor's mythology, a being whose ambition to destroy the Nine Realms with the Twilight Sword predates the current era of Asgardian history and will presumably outlast whatever era comes next. He is not a villain in the sense of someone who has chosen malice as a response to specific circumstances. He is something more elemental than that, a force of destruction that is simply what it is in the same way that fire is what it is, indifferent to the particulars of what it consumes and requiring no grievance to motivate its burning. His relationship to the Ragnarok cycle is structural rather than personal. He is one of the mechanisms through which the destruction is accomplished, and his patience, the quality that makes him genuinely terrifying, is the patience of something that measures time in geological terms and is therefore perfectly willing to wait. Thor's relationship with the concept of Ragnarok evolved across the decades of his story, in ways that mirrored his broader psychological and spiritual development. The young Thor, the one who had walked into Jotunheim with the warrior's certainty that courage was its own justification, approached Ragnarok as he approached most things, as a problem to be solved through sufficient application of force, as something that could be prevented if one fought hard enough and cleverly enough, and with sufficient commitment to the cause. This approach had the nobility of genuine intent and the limitation of insufficient imagination, because Ragnarok is specifically the kind of problem that cannot be solved through force, that in fact grows more certain the more frantically one attempts to prevent it through the same tools that created the conditions for it. The mature Thor's relationship with the cycle was shaped by the accumulated experience of having faced it, or versions of it, multiple times, of having watched the destruction arrive and survived it, and participated in whatever reconstruction followed, and of having developed through this repetition the understanding of what the cycle actually required. Not prevention, which was not available, not endurance, which was insufficient, something more demanding and more honest than either, the willingness to examine what within Asgard's culture and Asgard's choices had contributed to the conditions for destruction, and to carry that examination into the rebuilding, so that what was reconstructed was genuinely better than what had been lost rather than simply a recreation of the same patterns that had produced the same results. The breaking of Asgard across its various comic iterations is always both a physical and a spiritual event, and the physical dimension, though depicted with considerable dramatic power, is in many ways less significant than the spiritual one. Buildings can be rebuilt. The physical architecture of the Golden City can be raised again from whatever rubble the latest catastrophe has produced. What is harder to rebuild, and what the best versions of the Ragnarok story focus on with the most sustained attention, is the internal architecture, the set of values and relationships and ways of understanding the world that constitutes the living culture of a civilization, the things that make it what it is rather than simply where it is located. What is lost in the recurring destructions and what persists through them is one of the most interesting questions that the Ragnarok cycle raises, and the answer is not always what one might expect. The physical magnificence of Asgard, its towers and its treasuries, and its accumulated art and history is always vulnerable, always potentially combustible, always one catastrophic confrontation away from becoming the ruins that will need to be rebuilt. What persists, what has persisted through every cycle of the wheel, is something less tangible and more durable, the character of certain individuals, the specific qualities of courage and loyalty and love that have been tested in the fire repeatedly and have survived the testing repeatedly, not unchanged but recognizably themselves. Thor persists. The essential qualities that make Thor the person he is persist through every destruction and every rebuilding, and this persistence is itself one of the things the cycle is designed to demonstrate. The Asgard that is rebuilt after each Ragnarok is never identical to what came before it, and this is important to understand correctly. It is not a failure of the rebuilding that the result is different from the original. It is the point of the rebuilding. The cycle does not exist to preserve Asgard in amber, to ensure that the Golden City is restored to exactly its previous configuration after each destruction. It exists to provide the conditions under which Asgard can become something better than it was, in which the lessons that the destruction carried can be incorporated into the reconstruction, in which the civilization that rises from the ashes has learned from the fire and is therefore less likely to produce the conditions for the next fire, or at least less quickly. The emotional experience of living inside the cycle, for Thor and for the Asgardians who survive each iteration of Ragnarok, has a quality that is difficult to translate into the vocabulary of mortal experience, because mortals do not typically survive the destruction of their civilization and participate in its reconstruction with the specific perspective of someone who remembers what came before. The closest analogy might be the experience of someone who has lived through a great personal catastrophe, who has seen everything they built and loved destroyed, and who has had to decide in the ruins of their previous life whether to rebuild and what to carry forward from what was lost. The scale is cosmological rather than personal, but the psychological and spiritual texture of the experience has recognizable human dimensions that make it accessible to readers who have never contemplated the twilight of the gods. Thor's relationship with fate and prophecy, which the Ragnarok cycle forces him to engage with directly and repeatedly, is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of his character across the full span of his mythology. The Norse tradition that gave him his origins is deeply preoccupied with fate, with the question of whether the foreknowledge of doom changes anything about how one should live in its shadow, with the courage or the foolishness, or some irreducible combination of both that is required to fight against something one knows cannot ultimately be prevented. Thor's answer to these questions, arrived at through the experience of multiple cycles rather than through abstract reasoning, is something close to the position that the fighting matters not because it changes the outcome but because it changes the fighter. That the choice to face inevitable doom with whatever one has is not a delusion about one's power to prevent it, but an expression of fidelity to the values that make the thing being defended worth defending in the first place. The relationship between Ragnarok and renewal, between the destruction and what comes after it, gives the cycle its most consoling dimension, the dimension that makes it possible to sit with the concept of apocalypse without being overwhelmed by it, because Ragnarok is not only an ending, it is the clearing of ground for something new, the burning away of what has become too rigid or too corrupted or too attached to its own previous forms to allow genuine growth, the specific violence of transformation that precedes genuine renewal. The fires of Surtur, terrible as they are, make possible the green that grows in their aftermath, and this is not a comfortable or an easy thing to hold in mind while the fires are burning, but it is a true thing. and the mythology that carries it is doing the reader the service of telling a hard truth rather than a comfortable one. The lesson embedded in the Ragnarok cycle, distilled from all its iterations and all its variations across the decades of Marvel storytelling that have engaged with it, is something like this: that the most important question about any civilization or any person is not whether they can prevent destruction, because destruction is always coming, in one form or another, for everything that exists, but whether they can face what is coming with enough honesty and enough love to ensure that what survives the fire is worth rebuilding around. Thor has faced this question more times than any simple accounting would seem to allow, and his answers have been imperfect and costly, and sometimes arrived too late to prevent losses that a better answer might have avoided. But they have been genuine, and they have been his. And in the long run, these qualities matter more than the perfection that the circumstances never made available. The battles that define a warrior are not always the ones that produce the most dramatic victories, and the history of Thor's conflicts across the 9 realms and beyond is most honestly understood not as a catalogue of triumphs, but as a landscape of encounters that left marks on the person who survived them, marks that accumulated over centuries into the specific shape of a god who had learned, through the most demanding curriculum available, what strength was actually for. The thunder and the lightning that accompanied him into every significant confrontation of his career were not merely weapons. They were, in a sense, a kind of language, the external expression of an internal state that changed and deepened and became more complex with each encounter, so that the thunder that accompanied the mature Thor into battle carried within it all the previous thunders, all the previous battles, all the previous losses and recoveries that had brought him to this particular moment on this particular field. To hear the thunder in Thor's story is to hear not just the sound of a god's power, but the accumulated weight of everything that power had been through. The war against the serpent, known also as the Serpent of Fear and as Borson, who was revealed to be Odin's own brother and therefore Thor's uncle, introduced into the mythology a dimension of family darkness that went deeper than even Loki's complicated relationship with the Asgardian bloodline. The serpent's power was fear itself, the most ancient and most inescapable of human vulnerabilities, and this choice of domain was not arbitrary, but was the most precise possible challenge to everything Thor had been working to become. Thor had learned courage through the long process of his education, had developed a quality of fearlessness that was not the absence of danger recognition, but the willingness to act rightly in the presence of fear, and the serpent's power therefore targeted not a weakness in his armour, but the armour itself, the very quality of his heroic development that he had worked hardest to build. The prophecy surrounding this conflict was unambiguous and uncompromising, in a way that placed it firmly in the tradition of the Norse fatalism that the Ragnarok cycle had already established. Thor would kill the serpent would kill Thor. He would walk 9 steps after the killing blow landed before falling to the poison that the serpent's death would release into him, and those 9 steps would be the last steps he took. This was known. This was not a possibility or a warning, but a certainty, and Thor's response to this certainty was the mature expression of everything his long education had produced in him. He did not seek a way around it. He did not spend the time available to him in frantic attempts to locate a loophole in the prophecy's logic. He spent it preparing, making peace with what he could make peace with, attending to the relationships and responsibilities that mattered most, and then walking into the confrontation with the same quality of settled, clear-eyed commitment that had characterized his best moments since the hammer first returned to his hand in the New Mexico desert. The 9 steps he took after the serpent fell are among the most quietly powerful images in Thor's entire mythology, and their power comes not from drama or spectacle, but from the specific quality of will they represent. 9 steps. Not fleeing, not collapsing, not crying out against the injustice of a death that the prophecy had already determined was coming. 9 steps forward, in the direction he had been moving when the poison entered him, as if the momentum of a life lived in service of others had its own gravity that continued operating even as the life itself was ending. It is an image that says more about who Thor had become than any number of victories over lesser enemies could communicate, because it captures not what he could do, but what he chose to do with the last of what he had. The battles with the Celestials represent a different register of conflict, one in which the opposition was less a villain in any conventional sense, and more a force of cosmic evaluation, whose indifference to individual heroism was itself one of the most unsettling things Thor had ever been required to face. The Celestials are among the oldest beings in the Marvel Universe, enormously powerful entities whose purposes and judgment processes operate according to criteria that even the most ancient of the Asgardians could not claim to fully understand. Their interventions in planetary history, their role in seeding and evaluating the development of life across the cosmos, created situations in which Thor's usual toolkit of martial excellence and moral courage was inadequate, not because the situations demanded more power, but because they demanded a different kind of engagement entirely, one organized around wisdom and patience, and the willingness to accept limitations that could not be overcome through any amount of force. Thor's encounters with the Celestials produced in him a quality of humility that was distinct from the humility his exile had cultivated, which was the humility of someone learning to acknowledge the value of what he had previously dismissed. This was the humility of someone confronting the existence of forces and purposes so far beyond his comprehension that the appropriate response was not opposition, but a kind of reverent attention, an acknowledgement that the cosmos was larger and stranger and more complexly organized than even a god's considerable experience had fully prepared him for. This is not a comfortable lesson for a warrior, and Thor did not find it comfortable. He found it necessary. The long war against Surtur, which stretched across multiple iterations of the Ragnarok cycle and multiple eras of Thor's mythological history, had a quality of patience on both sides that gave it a different emotional texture from most of Thor's conflicts. Surtur waited with the patience of elemental fire, unhurried, certain of the eventual outcome, his ambition as constant and as undramatic as the geological processes that shape continents across timescales that make individual lifetimes invisible. Thor opposed him with something that needed to be renewed rather than simply sustained, a commitment that had to be rechosen in each era rather than simply carried forward from the previous one, because the knowledge of Surtur's eventual success, the knowledge that the fire would come eventually regardless, made the opposition feel, in certain moments, like the most futile gesture available to a sentient being. What made the opposition worthwhile, and what Thor's engagement with the Surtur question revealed about his deepest understanding of heroism, was precisely that it was not guaranteed to succeed and was chosen anyway. The gesture of opposition that knows it may ultimately fail is a more honest expression of heroic values than the opposition that proceeds in comfortable certainty of victory, because it strips away the self-interest that can hide inside confident heroism and leaves visible only the commitment itself, the choice to stand between the fire and the things one loves with the full knowledge that the fire is very old and very patient, and that one's own strength is finite in ways that the fire's is not. The cost of Asgardian warfare was something that the gleaming surface of the Golden City did not always make visible, and one of the things that Thor's maturity brought him was an increasingly clear-eyed attention to this cost, an unwillingness to allow the grandeur of the cause to obscure the specific weight of individual losses. The warriors who fell in the defense of Asgard across the centuries of its history were not abstractions or statistics, even when their number became large enough that holding each one individually in mind required a deliberate effort. They were people who had made choices about how to live and how to die, people whose absence left specific silences in specific places, people whose courage in the face of overwhelming opposition was not honoured by being subsumed into the larger narrative of cosmic heroism, but by being acknowledged as what it actually was, the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing that sentient beings do, which is to put themselves in harm's way for the sake of something they love. Thor carried the weight of these losses with him, and the carrying changed him over time in ways that his enemies often did not anticipate, and could not fully account for in their strategic calculations. He became more careful, more deliberate, less inclined toward the grand gesture that spent lives freely in service of a dramatic victory, and more inclined toward the patient, thorough preparation that minimized loss even at the cost of minimizing glory. This is not the transformation that warrior cultures typically celebrate, because it is not a transformation toward greater power or greater ferocity, but toward something quieter and more disciplined, the restraint of someone who has learned that the lives of the people beside him are worth more than the satisfaction of a decisive confrontation. The battle on the Bifrost, which occurred in various forms across multiple significant moments in Thor's mythology, always carried a particular symbolic weight because of what the Bifrost represented in the cosmological architecture of the Nine Realms. The Rainbow Bridge was not merely a transit mechanism, it was the connection between worlds, the physical expression of the web of relationships and dependencies that bound the Nine Realms to each other and to Asgard at their centre. To fight on the Bifrost was to fight for connection itself, for the possibility of relationship between peoples and worlds that could not reach each other without it, and this symbolic dimension gave those battles a quality of existential significance that went beyond the immediate tactical stakes. Heimdall's role in these moments was always quietly heroic, in the specific way that sustained, unglamorous commitment tends to be heroic. The heroism of someone who has stood at the same post through every catastrophe and every crisis, and every attempt to breach the defences that his vigilance sustained, not because the post was comfortable, or because the work was recognised with the celebrations reserved for those whose heroism produced more visible results, but because someone had to stand there, and he had accepted that responsibility with his whole self, and had never, in any of the iterations of his story across the centuries of Marvel's telling of it, flinched from what it required. The evolution from warrior king to something that did not yet have an adequate name in Asgard's vocabulary was one of the most significant and most quietly accomplished developments in Thor's long story. And it is culminating. This is a position that Thor had been developing the philosophical tools to engage with across his entire career. The recognition that real suffering does not automatically confer moral authority on whatever response it generates. That understanding what made a person into what they became is not the same as endorsing what they became, and that the most honest form of compassion was one that held both the understanding and the opposition without collapsing either into the other. The siege of Asgard, which came at the hands of Norman Osborn and his appropriated forces in one of the more jarring intersections between Thor's mythological world and the more politically grounded concerns of Marvel's broader universe, demonstrated that the threats to Asgard were not confined to the cosmological registers in which they were most naturally discussed, but could arrive from entirely mundane directions, from the ambitions of a man with institutional authority and no qualifications for the use of it. Thor's response to this particular threat was shaped by constraints that previous battles had not imposed, the constraints of operating within a human political context, where the straightforward application of divine power carried consequences that his earlier career had not required him to calculate. He was learning in this period a form of strategic patience that was different from the patience of facing cosmic inevitability. It was the patience of someone operating within a system of relationships and accountabilities that required restraint not because the opposition was overwhelming, but because the exercise of unconstrained power would damage things worth protecting even in the act of protecting them. What persisted through all of these battles, through the defeats as much as the victories, through the losses that could not be recovered and the costs that could not be reduced, and the moments when the weight of all the previous conflicts made the prospect of another one feel almost impossible to sustain, was the same quality that had first expressed itself in the moment Mjolnir returned to his hand in the New Mexico desert. The quality of being genuinely present for what the moment required, of not holding back some portion of himself in reserve against future need, of meeting each confrontation with the full commitment of everything he had, not because victory was guaranteed, or because the sacrifice would be adequately acknowledged, or because the outcomes would justify the costs, but because the people who needed protecting were real, and their need was present and he had the power to respond to it, and therefore he did. The story of Thor Odinson does not end so much as it breathes, settles, continues in the way that all true things continue, not through noise or spectacle, but through the patient persistence of what they have always been at their core. What remains, when the battles are distant and the golden halls have softened into something more like a feeling than a place, is simply this: that power without love is incomplete, that worthiness is not inherited but chosen, again and again in the small moments as much as the large ones, and that the willingness to be changed by what we love is not weakness, but the deepest form of strength available to any living thing. You have travelled far tonight, across worlds and centuries and the long arc of a heart learning to open. Let that journey carry you now into rest, into the soft darkness where no hammer is needed and no battle waits, where the only thing asked of you is simply to let go, to drift and to sleep.